Hi, this is Red in April. In today's video, we'll be working on our roof. We're putting up more roof beams, and at the end of the video, I'll give you a good cost breakdown in detail of the roof beams construction. In our last video, we put the first 4 beams up for our house, and we're working on the next 2 now. Thought I'd take a moment just to talk a little bit about the beams and kind of why we chose these beams originally. So we did consider, more of a traditional structural beam, which have been like a regular I-beam. We moved away from that idea and decided to go towards this for a couple of reasons. The first was cost and weight. First of all, regular I-beams are more expensive. They're also a lot heavier, and so they're wouldn't really be possible for us to manipulate them by hand, meaning we had to have the added expense of a crane or some kind of heavy equipment in order to move them and set them in place. And then the other thing is the metal is thick enough on an I-beam that we wouldn't be able to drill into it with like self-tapping screws in order to attach purlins and pieces of wood to the beams. And so it would have been really difficult to attach, say, the purlins to the beams. You'd have had to drill through the metal and bolt everything together with nuts and bolts. But we knew that with the C-purlins, it's 14 gauge, and you can get heavy-duty self-tapping screws that you could screw through the wood and through the beam and attach everything together that way. And so those were kind of our primary considerations in going with the C-purlins and building them the way that we have. We're putting up the 6th beam here. By this time, we're getting more proficient at this, and it's going faster and smoother. Another thing I'll mention too is that once we had the first 3 or 4 beams up, I went ahead and put a beam diagonally across those beams, tying the first, I believe it was the first 4 beams together diagonally with a 14-foot long board. And so that really ties the roof into kind of a monolithic slab instead of just all these pieces that are connected to the walls. And it actually gives the walls a lot more strength from bowing or flexing inward or outward. If you want some more information on how we put these together, you can refer to our last video. We spent a little bit of time there explaining the process of building them, the beams and the extensions. We made the beams 2 at a time, and part of the process was to make these wooden spacers to go in between the beams. Every time we put a beam up, we had to put the wooden spacer in between before we put the next beam on. And I ended up being really happy at how tightly these wooden spacers fit together. It's actually really close all around, even the inside contour of these metal beams. So I wanted to show you how I made these. I started off by cutting them to the right width, and then I had to cut them down. These are 2x10s, and they're a little taller than I needed, so I'm ripping them down to 8 inches, 8 1/8 inches. And then the next thing was to cut out a little rectangle for the vent. So we want to allow for ventilation between each beam. And so just cutting that out here, you just kind of finish up with my little Japanese saw, and cutting with the circle saw, and then finish up with the Japanese saw. And then on the ends, I needed to cut out just a little, kind of like a 1/4 inch deep and then 2.5 inch wide piece out of the end of each board. And the easiest way to do that was just to mark the width and then cut down about 3/8 of an inch with my little Japanese saw here, and then run it down on the table saw. Once I've got these marked and cut down about 3/8 of an inch, I move to the table saw and use it to cut out that last little bit of wood. When I was first thinking about this design, I was really worried about how I was going to get these filler blocks here to fit nice and tight on the inside and really, fill in the gap and make it nice and tight in between the beams, because it's a funny shape, that C shape on either side. And so I just kind of started playing with it and seeing how close I could get it, and ended up perfecting a little method here that worked really well. Those little notches that I just got through cutting out, actually the little corner pieces, I'm cutting off here the corner pieces that allow it to kind of follow the contour of the inside curve of the metal. These are all just little steps that allow it to closely follow the contour of the inside of the beam and end up with a really nice tight fit. Having a nice tight fit here really locks the beams in and kept them from wanting to move side to side. They also lock the beam down to the top rail because these beams are going in over that kind of flange, and when I screw these blocks down to the top rail, they lock the beam down to the top rail as well. So it's another mechanical connection from the beam to the top rail. The block that goes on the south side is the tricky one. It has to be able to accommodate that extension that slides into the inside of the beam up at that end. And so there's a couple notches that I had to work out here, and then a tapered kind of sloping cut that I had to do along one back side, which was the first one or two were really hard, but then I got into a little routine of how to do it, and it went pretty quickly. So I was able to use the saw and the circle saw and my hand saw here to cut out those notches, and also the saw to pre-cut that sloping cut down, and then I actually used a chisel later on to kind of knock out that last bit of wood along that slope. I really enjoy woodworking, so I enjoy using hand tools anytime I get a chance. So this part of the build and this kind of thing I really like. Getting to be able to use my hand saws, to be able to use a chisel here. It's just a lot of fun doing this kind of stuff. This little end piece here was a bit of a challenge with all these angles and grooves and slots and stuff. But it was actually a lot of fun to do. I ended up having to make 13 of these, basically one to go in between each beam. So 13 of these that had kind of the special end on them, and then 13 that didn't have the special end, so 26 pieces total, I guess. By the end, it was going really smooth and had a good system going. Getting ready here to put on the 7th beam, so this is the halfway point, and we're feeling really good about this. We've got better at doing it, and it's going well. Daughter's helping out here, which makes lifting up these, roughly 175-pound beams without the extension a whole lot easier. So we're just kind of lifting it up onto the scaffolding and then up onto the ladder, and then both ends up onto the beams themselves. As I was figuring out how to lay out these beams, I wanted them on basically 4-foot centers, and I wanted them to wind up being directly over a stud so they have that extra support all the way down to the footer. But because the length of the house is 50 feet, that doesn't divide evenly by 4, and so I had to offset a couple of beams or make closer together in one or two spots. And so one of the places that I chose to do that was the center of the house, because it's in the middle of the longest unsupported span on the interior. And so these beams are going to be basically 32 inches apart instead of the normal 48 inches. And also at this point, because these two beams are closer together, I decided to change the offset on the extensions. So here I am putting up the extension on the 7th beam, and I have it offset to the right-hand side. And I did that on purpose so that when we get to the center with these two closer together beams, I can offset the extension in the other direction, and it'll make them appear from the outside to be farther apart, so kind of make up for them being closer together. When I'm attaching these beams actually to the walls, typically I'm using 2 bolts on each side that go down through both layers of, there's 2 pieces of 2x4 on that top rail, so it goes down through 3 inches of wood, bolts all that together, and that's the typical when it lines up directly over a stud. There are a couple places where it lines up over multiple studs. There's like 2 studs together, or it's kind of extra thick there, and there are a few places where that bolt can't go down into open space. And so in those cases, basically I'll use a long lag bolt instead, which is just, it's a 3/8 bolt, so it's the same size of bolt, but it has really coarse threads that's made to bite into wood. And so I think it was like a 2.5 inch long 3/8 lag bolt that I have to use occasionally as I was going through here, if there was too many studs or kind of obstructions in the way and I couldn't get a bolt through. It ended up working really good to make these 2 at a time. That's kind of how what we had space for, and it just worked out well for us to make them a couple at a time. But there's quite a few steps to building these beams, building the spacers. Each beam we had to do the prep work, take care of the rust, put it together, bolt it together, and then we had to make the blocks and get those in place. And then we had to make the extensions and get those ready. We had to paint them too, paint the extensions and paint the exposed beam at the other end too, because it's going to be exposed eave on the south side as well, or on the north side as well. So anyway, all those steps add up, and so to make 2 beams and get them installed ended up taking about 2 days. So about a day per beam was kind of our average, although we were picking up speed towards this point in the project, and maybe doing a little bit better than that as we kind of refined our technique. We're pretty happy with how these beams are working out so far. So, we'd originally bought these beams to use in our aircrete home design, and the original plan was to fill these 4-foot gaps between the beams with aircrete. C-channel would kind of help hold that aircrete in place, and so that was the original idea. When we moved away from aircrete, we decided to keep these beams, as our roofing material, because we liked the idea of being able to, using the strength of those beams to create a thinner roof that doesn't require an attic space, that allows us to have a sloping interior ceiling and nice high ceilings on the side with all the south-facing windows. And also, we got these beams at a really good price. They're relatively inexpensive, with wood prices skyrocketing there for a while, and even now they're not too good. The traditional trusses have been pretty expensive. Maybe more so than they had been in the past, and they're also a really long lead time. We're hearing now that some pretty outrageous lead times on trusses, and so anyway, all those factors kind of combined to make us decide to go with this roof, and so far so good. We're really liking it. I'll give you kind of a quick cost breakdown. So we bought these metal beams, the 8-inch beams, for $100 each, and we're using 28 of them, so that's $2,800 for the 8-inch metal beams. The 6-inch beams we're using 7 of, and we paid $60 each for those, so that's $420. And then we have about $125 in spray paint and about $150 in bolts and hardware. So that brings the total up to $34.95, so just under $3,500 basically for all of our roofing beams. Not too bad for a 1,508 square foot roof covering our 1,200 square foot home. In our next video, we'll be putting up the final 4 beams and starting work on the purlins. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe.